I use these names myself, Yahuah, Yahusha, Yahweh. If you just look at some of my early videos, you'll see those names. And like I said, I want you to know I use these terms like Yahweh and Yahusha. I don't anymore, and I want to explain why. Because I traced where they came from. And once I saw where they came from, and my channel's called Fleeing Babylon, so you can kind of get an idea of where they came from. So once I saw where these names were coming from, and you don't have to look very hard, you can go look it up yourself. Two Protestant men in the 1930s started using, then we're talking white, not black men, but white men in the Protestant America were started to use these names, Yahusha and Yahuah and Yahweh and all these different names that are so prominent in our day now. But we never sit and ask, where did they come up with these names? And are they even valid names? Do they even fit Hebrew at all? And then what Hebrew are we talking about? Because are we talking about the Hebrew from 3,000, 4,000 years ago? Or are we talking about the Hebrew from about 1,000 years ago from medieval Europe, from up in the Ukraine area? And I think you know where I'm going with that. But to whose names are we going to trust? And I want to bring out in this video that for all of you that are Bantu or Igbo or Yoruba or Iwe or all the different groups or even Hamite groups that are in Africa or your ancestors come from there, why would you not consider the names your own ancestors used rather than using the names that came from this modern, basically false or fake Hebrew, and use them as if they are the creator's names? I understand that people want to get closer to, I do, and I want to go through the issue of colonial Africa, of course, and America, and all the colonizing and how religion was used against the people, and how that, of course, has made Jesus and God and all these names to be almost untouchable names for some people. But I also want to look at the actual names they've been replaced with, because are they any better or are they actually worse? The Yahusha, the Yahweh, and all those names. Because we have to be honest. We can be honest about where did Jesus come from, and where did God and Lord, and where did they all come from, Zeus or wherever people think they came from. But we actually have to be honest as well about where the new names came from. The Yahuah, the Yahweh, the Yahusha, like I said, all these different names. And where did they come from? And are they really ancient, or are they actually modern names? Because we forget that the true fathers in Africa especially, because of course in Americas and elsewhere where scattered Israel went, they lost their name and their fathers and their culture and all those things. But if we look back to Africa, like the video I just did on the languages in Africa, then we see that the true Hebrew is most likely going to be found among the Bantu, Igbo, and the Yoruba, and all the different groups in Africa. The Proto-Niger Congo language group is probably your real Hebrew, and it's over there, and it hasn't changed for thousands of years, except expanded into multiple languages. But if you go back to the beginning, you can find the name for Creator, the name for God. I'm not sure about the name for Jesus, but you can certainly find the names for most of the things that you find in the Bible, rather than going to a modern Hebrew made out of German and Yiddish and all kinds of other ways merged with a bit of Hebrew. And we have to try to get to the bottom, not just of Jesus, and is that a good valid word, but is Yahuah or Yahusha, are those valid words to use as well when we're talking about deity? I want to point out right at the beginning, this is not about defending Christianity at all. I don't even consider myself a Christian in that sense at all. If anything, I would consider myself trying to follow the way of the Ebionites or the earliest Christians, even before Paul. That's sort of where I'm at. But this is not a defense of colonial Christianity or the use of Jesus and that type of thing at all. I just want to look at the evidence itself honestly and look at where it actually leads. If you look at the Bantu, I'm going to go through some of these groups right now quickly. The Bantu, their name that they have for the creator is Nyambe, and it has different forms like Molunga and Mungu and Nzambi. Of course, I'm not saying these right, but the oldest traceable root of the Bantu supreme being comes from the name Nyambe or something like that, connected to the verb meaning to begin, which of course makes sense with the I am from the scriptures. And if you are Igbo or that group, and I know a lot of the groups don't like to talk to one another, but if you're from the Igbo or Igbo tradition, or Igbo tradition, the supreme being is often looked at as Chukwu, or Chikuwu. The Great Spirit, of course, going back to the same I am, or to the Father. Chi meaning spiritual being, and Chukwu meaning great or supreme. You know, of course, I've gotten this from AI, so I would love all my viewers to please comment and correct me on, and add anything you please add in, whatever you can about the languages. I love learning about all these things. It's fascinating. And then if you're from the Yoruba group, they have a different name. In your tradition, it's called, and I'm going to not get this right, Olodumare, something like that. A name so ancient, it says in AI, it says so ancient that its true etymology is described as scholars as archaic, long, long, long ago. This is an old, so when you're looking at the Hebrew text that we use today, you know, they call it the Masoretic text or the Hebrew text, we are deceived. I've been deceived. People said, oh yeah, I want to go to the Hebrew. I want to translate from the Hebrew. And I'm going, once I realized that text isn't Hebrew at all, not at all. It has some Hebrew in it, mixed in, but it's more Aramaic. It's more European and a mixture of so many different things, but it's certainly not Hebrew. For me, being from outside of Africa, if I was going to Africa, I'd go to one of those three groups, or the UA. I'd be going to Africa. If I wanted to find Hebrew, I believe I'll find it in Africa. Would never, for me, use a text that comes from the people that we'll get into here in a minute. But this name means the owner of heaven, or everlasting majesty, or fullness. So all three of the great groups of language beginnings in Africa, and the others as well, they all have your own traditions. And for the people, as I said, that are in Americas, the Black Africans and the African Americans, as they're called, once they wake up, that maybe they've been in the Americas for 2,000 or 3,000 years, that may be the case. But I believe all of it flows back to Africa at one point in time, whether you came in slave ships, your people, or you came long before Columbus, and I think it's probably both. But either way, those names are ancient names. So why would we use recent names, especially when they're given by white Protestant groups, and then carried on? We're going to get into why they were used and why Black Africans in America started picking up those names. But just remember that the names in Africa were just suppressed by colonial powers who tried to destroy the languages and the culture wherever they went, in the Americas, everywhere. That was their purpose, one world, group. So you have to knock off everything that keeps people in their true tribes they used to be in, and with hooks to their own people. But they have survived, and they are still there. And I know that you that are in Africa can please comment about that, but it's still there. The names are still there, and there's other different names as well, like I said. So question yourself as you start into this video, why would I give up the names my fathers have passed down for thousands of years, orally mainly, in Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, among the Shemites? And in the Hamites, you have the Septuagint in the Ethiopian Bible. So why would you go with a Masoretic text from the people that hated Jesus, that made a different Bible? It will get. So think back to what. So consider, where do you want your roots to be? Do you want your roots to be with this group that I'll put the picture up here, or do you want your roots to be with this group or these groups in Africa? Because language is who people are. And if you connect to the wrong language, you connect to the wrong people. But if you connect to the right language, then you can connect to the right name of God, or the Father, or Abba, or even Jesus. You can go find the name that suits you and what you believe is the true name of God, rather than trusting it to a bunch of Europeans. Colonial powers didn't just come from Britain. Colonial powers have come from all the way from Ukraine, all the way to Germany, France, as you know, all the different places. But they had one thing in common. They were colonial powers. So why would you take their books and trust them? I know, because of the hurt, many don't trust the Christian Bible that came from Greek. And I get that, and I understand that, I really do, or at least I try to. But why would you leave that group of, why would you leave that Gentile text and go to a Gentile Hebrew text and trust that over the Gentile Greek text, it doesn't make sense, but let's get into it. So this movement to use these new Hebrew or names like Yahuah and Yah and Yahusha and Yahweh and all those different names, this is a really quite modern movement. It is not an ancient movement at all, at all. They call it the Sacred Name Movement. And like I said, it's not ancient. And the first use of it, as I said, was in 1936 by white Protestant ministers in the USA, John Briggs and Paul Penn. And there's a few others a little bit before that were starting to use it, but they're the main ones. So it's not ancient. It's not from Israel. It's not even from Hebrew. Even if we looked at old ancient Hebrew, they didn't even have vowels. It was a consonant language. But let's leave that alone for now. Dr. Danny Ben-Gigi, a former head of the Hebrew program in Arizona State University and a native Israeli Hebrew speaker, has stated plainly, there is no such name in Hebrew. People invented it to fit their theologies, talking about Yahusha and Yahuah and those names. There is something else about the origin of these names that rarely gets mentioned about this John Briggs and this Paul Penn and the founders of this we call Sacred Name Movement. They were not African American. I know I couldn't believe that when I found that out, actually. Because I see mostly these names being used by African Americans, and yet it didn't start. It started with some white guys. And they were American Protestant men working from a medieval manuscript. The basis of our Bible that comes from the Masoretic text is only 1,000-year-old Hebrew, Aramaic type of language. It really isn't what is real Hebrew. But that is what they took it from, and they felt by doing that, they could make this new name to get away from Jesus and those type of things. So I think we need to be very clear here. If you are using those names, you've adopted those names, not from Africans in Africa, of any of the groups, not even from really most Christians. You've adopted it from a couple of Protestant white guys. And it's been taken up by the Hebrew Israelite movement and pushing these names. And you'll see them everywhere on YouTube. Many people are using them, they don't even understand. I didn't, like I said, I used them and I didn't even understand where they come from, or I would never have touched them with a 10-foot pole. But that's just for me. But they were drawn from European Jewish scholarship. They weren't drawn from the time of Jesus at all, not even close. So the names that were presented to us as being these resurrected new names that have been found out, these ancient names for Jesus or God or the Father or Yahuah or whatever you want to say, they are just modern made up things. They are not ancient at all. Meanwhile, these words like Olodumare or Chukwu or Mulungu and all the different names from the different groups in Africa, they're ancient. They're dated to be like 6,000, 4,000. We're talking years old versus something that's not even 100 years old that's made up. And yet we are giving honor to these new names. And I want to get into why that happened. Because it's truly, to me, it's a sad story. And I'm going to do a video on this because it repeats over and over and over through the world since the Garden of Eden. But there were a couple really wonderful black men back in the late 1800s. Frank Cherry, who established a Church of the Living God in the American South, claimed a revelation, and that the emancipated slaves of America were the true descendants of biblical Hebrews, which is 100% what I believe, 100%. These were grassroots movements born directly from the trauma of slavery. Black men and women reaching into Scripture for dignity and identity after centuries of dehumanization, especially in the United States, but also in other parts of the Americas and elsewhere in the world, actually. So no one gave them this movement. No one handed them this theology. They built it from the ground up out of genuine spiritual hunger and raw pain of people trying to locate themselves in a world that had tried to erase them. That is the noble side of all of this. And I respect that immensely. Grassroots movement. But we'll see what happened very quickly. But it was in the 1930s that the white guy, Protestants brought out all these names. So then we get down to the 1960s, and we'll call that the third wave of Black Hebrew Israelite movement emerged, more militant, more focused on identity, energized by the civil rights era and Black power, and a generation hungry for ancient names and language that felt like reclamation of a long-lost past. And this is a specific moment when this sacred name terminology, or Yahuah, Yahusha, and all that kind of stuff, when that really began to be used was in the 60s among the Black African Americans. But remember, when this Black man, Frank Cherry, when he established the Church of the Living God in the American South, they founded it on a revelation, or he founded it on a revelation. But the movement that they were after was to try to help their people, which is, of course, wonderful. So I want to just go over this one thing clearly. The original grassroots movement in the 1880s, after slavery, and trying to find who the people were, the slaves, who they really were, and getting rid of the colonizers' Christianity and trying to find their way, was a genuine, independent, born from real spiritual hungry after slavery. That I believe, that's my personal belief, and that's what scholars tend to believe. But that is not what I'm examining in this video at all. What we're examining is how that genuine movement got absorbed in the following century, in the 1960s especially, and how Masonic structures from its own founders, the sacred name terminology from white American Protestants, and a foundational dependence on the Masoretic text, what we call the Hebrew text today, which is really just a medieval, 1,000-year-old European rabbinical mishmash. And scholars, they chose to use that text over the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint. And because of that, that's where we start to get into these names, Yahuah, Yahusha, those Yahweh, and all those different things. So layer by layer, the first and original layer, the grassroots movement, was genuine. But in came who? The secret society groups. And in came who? Some Protestant ministers that were white. And in came who? More secret society stuff. So layer by layer, what was presented as a recovery of ancient African and Hebrew heritage was actually being built from sources from Europe that had nothing to do with the ancient African heritage, which to me is so surprising. Why didn't they go over, and you can ask yourself, why didn't they go over to Africa and speak to the people who still had the inheritance from there, the fathers that never lost the language? To me, that would have made complete sense. If I was, let's say, living in China and my kids grew up in China and their kids, and they wanted to go back and learn English and learn the customs of, I'm a Canadian, but learn the customs, let's say, of England, well, then you'd probably go back to England, to the fathers, to find out what the language was, what the culture was, what the food was, all those things that were lost if you'd lived in China for 150 years and were cut off from those things. But for the interesting thing, and I have to think that why did this happen? Why did they go the way of those Hebrews who are Europeans who converted? Why did they go towards that group and their names and their scriptures and cast out the Greek ones, which are more than 1,000 years much older? And then instead of going over, as I said, to Africa, among any of the groups, they could have found the names, the real names that are 4,000 and 5,000 and 6,000 years old that the people of Shem in Africa were using for all this time. Anyway, it just makes me shake my head, and maybe some of my viewers have an idea why that might have happened. I want to say here very quickly, I'm going to do another video on this issue of why grassroots, things that are honest, lovers, men of God, why do their grassroots always get taken over immediately? As soon as little light comes out, why do they always get taken over by other movements? And so as we go through this, I don't ask you to change your mind. I ask you to go take what I'm giving you, please, and go and research it yourself. Go look it up. It's not even very hard to find. I'm going to read a comment that I got just recently, and it was disturbing for me, but it was a comment. So Yahusha and Yahuah, Lord, and then Baal, or fallen one, is God, and or Gadral, and fallen is Jesus, and Isus, and Zeus, and Christos, and Lucifer's devil. Wake up, people! It's all of the fallen. And I'm going like, I'm sorry, but I was just, when I read that, I was like, oh my God, because I read it just as I was starting to deal with this subject, and I'm going like, those names are all from those guys that came from up in Europe. That's where these names come from. They do not at all, none of them, not one of them, comes from the Hebrew even at the time of Jesus, which they really didn't even have. But even if we looked at the Aramaic Hebrew mix that was at Jesus' day, they didn't have these names. They didn't have vowels. Those vowels were all put in not even a few hundred years ago. So we're using these names as if they make us close to God, when in my opinion, they're taking us far, far away from God. And yes, if someone doesn't want to use the Greek Isus and Jesus and all those names and Lord, fine, I understand why some people would be uncomfortable with that. But like I said, at least then drop the other European text and go back and learn some Ethiopian Ge'ez, or go learn the father's languages of the Shemite people, whether it's Igbo, Bantu, or Yoruba, or Yahweh, all the different groups that are in Africa, and find the real name of the father, rather than repeating the Pharisees, whose father was the fallen one. Why are we using their language and their scriptures and their Bible to give us the names that we use to worship the Father? It is very, very, very disturbing to me. That's why I stopped for myself using those names completely. As soon as I found out, it was like, good, game over, I won't touch them. I don't get upset when people do use them, because we just don't know. I didn't know, and nobody got upset with me when I used them. So I don't want to mock this person. I recognize where this comes from. It's real, I understand that. But let's really look at this sacred name movement and these names and see if they hold up to scrutiny. The divine name that is in the Masoretic text, the YHWH, that as well is not ancient any more than the text is ancient. It's not. That's just another of these things. I'm not going to drive deep into that one today. But if you just look at that name, it has no vowels, just 4 letters. And there has been a matter of scholarly debate for centuries, because ancient Hebrew, like ancient Semitic writing systems, when they say Semitic, they mean Hamite or Afro-Asiatic writing systems, because they include the Hebrew in that group, and the video I did on that would explain that for you if you want to go look at that. But they didn't have vowels. So all these words, Jehovah and Yahweh and Yahuah and Yahusha and Yahuah, they're all reconstruction. There is no depth, not even 100 years of depth into these names. Every single one of them. They are not ancient names. No one alive today can tell you with certainty how those 4 letters, the YHWH, that the Masoretic texts use, how they're even pronounced. They have the letters, they have the Aramaic writing that they call Hebrew, which isn't really Hebrew anyway, but it's Aramaic. But they have that, but that doesn't tell you how they were pronounced. We just have the consonants. Because we have no vowels, we really don't know what the names were in the original text. No one does. It really, in many ways, is a dead language. The Hebrew that the 12 tribes had, at least in the old world, was a dead language. It's not found. Now, there might be some people that are watching this from in Africa, and they feel that their tribe in Africa, let's say in Ghana area or West Africa or somewhere, they still speak that ancient Hebrew that came out of Israel. That's possible. But among the people that went to Europe and all over the place, and into Spain and everywhere, yeah, I don't see it myself. I can't see it. Every time I look into it, I don't see it. So the honest starting point is, even if we accept the YHWH, which I don't, but if you do, you don't know what it means. You don't know how it sounded. You have no idea. You don't. And people quibble over the J in Jesus, And they don't quibble about all the vowels that were put into YHWH that we got from the Pharisees. Yahweh is the most academically, among scholars, accepted reconstruction. It has better credentials than Yahuah or Yahusha, but it's still a reconstruction. So remember that, it's just a reconstruction. The earliest scholarly proposal for this pronunciation appears in the 16th century, like 400 years ago. And it's based on Greek transcriptions in some early church sources that render the name, blah, 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 blah. So we're talking, there is no proof. There is nothing. There's nothing there. There is no way to come up with those names at all. So it's just a guess, a scholarly guess from the 1600s. But it is not confirmed in any way as pronunciation at all. Yeshua is the form most commonly presented in the true name of Jesus in the sacred name circles. And it is, as Dr. Ben Gigi stated, simply not a real Hebrew name. It does not exist in any ancient manuscript. We're talking, when he says ancient manuscript, they're talking about the last 1,000 years, ancient manuscripts of the Hebrew text. It does not follow Hebrew grammatical structure of modern Hebrew. It appears to be a hybrid construction attempting to combine the supposed divine name Yah with the word for salvation. But the combination was done incorrectly by people who did not have sufficient command of Hebrew to construct it properly. So I want to make clear I am not mocking or saying people using them like me. I use them and I don't want people mocking me either. But research for yourself. Where did these names really start? Are they really ancient? Are they really accurate? Because if we're going to strip away the name of Jesus and stop using that, then that's fine for people that don't like the colonial power. And Greek is not the name that Jesus would have been living under, because he would have been speaking Aramaic. But we don't have the Aramaic name for Jesus. We just don't at all, or for any of them. We have the Greek names from 2,200 years ago. And yes, they are Greek. That is a European language. So we don't have the ancient Hebrew language or even the Aramaic language from Jesus' day to show that these names are accurate at all, or where the vowel placements were, or even if they even were the right letters. This part here, I think, for me is the most important, that I hope if you come this far that you can see. The Masoretic text, or what we call the Hebrew Bible, is not really even Hebrew, right? It is a mishmash, as I said. The original Hebrew, the Hebrew that came from Shem, that went through Egypt and was changed a bit, and then went through Babylon and was lost completely, and was brought into Aramaic script, which is, as they call it, Shemitic, but it's not Shemitic. It's actually Afro-Asiatic script. So the script that the Hebrew Bible has today is not Hebrew. It's called Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew, and it's not old. Like I said, it's 1,000 years old. And even the letters that were used are taken from Aramaic, which Aramaic came from Assyria and Babylon. So they are Hamitic languages. They're not Shemite languages. So if you believe your ancestor is Eber, and he was Hebrew, and he went and lived in West Africa or somewhere in Africa, he brought the true Shemitic language with him, the language of Eber, which we would really call Hebrew. But the Hebrew of today never passed the word, not a word. It did not come from Eber, the Hebrew. This Hebrew is a Hebrew born in mostly after 70 AD and taken from Aramaic and then repurposed. And all, you can look it up, all the texts that made before 1000 AD, like only 1,000 years ago, all the Hebrew texts that really are Aramaic, they're all gone too, lost, destroyed, whatever. They're not there. All we have is from 1,000 onward. That's it. There's nothing earlier. The only early document that we have is actually the Septuagint Bible, which is the Greek translated directly from the Aramaic Hebrew of way before, 250 years before Jesus. That text we have and still have. But we don't like that text, of course, because it came through the churches. And so when people are dumping the churches, We tend to want to dump God. We want to tend to dump Jesus. A lot of people do. And we want to go back to a lot of people want to go back to the original, to the true Torah and the true thing. But if you go to the people in Europe that are living a sort of Torah type thing, do you believe they're living the Torah that they were living 2,000 years ago? No. Jesus himself said that they were living the doctrines of men. They weren't living the Torah that Moses actually gave. They were living a new thing, the same thing that the Pharisees always lived, which is their new laws, their new ways merged into somewhat the Old Testament. But it is not at all the same thing. And Jesus, 2,000 years ago, commented on that. So from 2,000 years ago till now, do you think they improved it and went back to the original? No, I think they strayed even further, without a doubt. From my studies, they strayed even further. But almost every Bible we have, bar none, comes from the Old Testament part of our Bibles, come from the Masoretic. I'm going to call it modern Hebrew or fake Hebrew text. That's where it was taken from. Whether it's the King James, the New English Standard, or doesn't matter. Every one of them, they take the Old Testament from a medieval, and hear me on this, medieval document dated to 1008 AD. That is the oldest Masoretic Hebrew text in existence, called the Leningrad Codex, 1008 years after Christ. And this is the document being used to recover what is presented as the original names, not just of God, but of all kinds of other people, and also of Jesus. So remember, I've made this point. It is written in a foreign alphabet. It was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Aramaic-Hebrew mix. The script used in the Masoretic text that we have today from 1,000 years ago is square block Hebrew letters, and I will put some pictures of that here. And it's what you see in Torah scrolls today. And it is called Katav Ashuri in the Talmud itself. The name literally means Assyrian writing. So the Talmud of the Hebrews of our day, they openly acknowledge that this script was adopted from Assyria after the Babylonian captivity. But the issue is the language they chose, they say themselves, is Assyrian writing, not Hebrew. It is not the original Israelite script that Moses took out of Egypt. The original Israelite writing was Paleo-Hebrew. And in my opinion, that even still was altered somewhat from their time in Egypt. And if you want to find true Hebrew script, I think you'll find it somewhere in West Africa one day. But mainly it was an oral tradition there. But remember, it looked nothing like we see in the Masoretic text. They are not even, you can't even tell they're the same language or writing style. So when we look at the Septuagint text that is from 250 BC, yes, it's in Greek, but it was actually translated from a Hebrew text that was Hebrew Aramaic at the time that it was translated. And so when we mock the Septuagint or put it down because it has Greek and it uses Isus and those kind of things, remember that those names were used 250 years before Jesus was even born. For Joshua, the name Isus in Greek, or Jesus, it was the name of Joshua, the one with Moses. That is a fact, and that's in that scripture. It is Greek, so you can't say that it's Hebrew, because it's not. It's Greek, and all the scholars know it is Greek. And all the New Testament that we have is written in Greek. There are no even Aramaic copies. Maybe they wrote in Aramaic and translated to Greek at some time, or maybe they just wrote in Greek. We don't know. But I do know that Jesus, when he was walking around with his apostles, they weren't speaking Greek generally. They were speaking Aramaic, which was the language of the day. And our new sacred names movement over the last 100 years, they use the Masoretic text, not the Greek one. But by using this Masoretic text and taking on the vowels that they believe come from the Masoretic text, and then listening some Pentecostal or Protestant ministers from not even 100 years ago who are white men in America, they've now taken those names and brought them in as if they were ancient names for the Most High God and for the Savior or the Creator or whoever we want to discuss in theological ways. So the logic does not hold. If you reject colonial Christianity because it was used against you, which is fair, by people with an agenda, and they did, you must apply the same scrutiny to the text compiled by people with an equally documented agenda that did exactly the same things to your people in exactly the same way, just using a different text and a different language that they had. But to think that you're going to get something different from the Greek than you get from our modern Hebrew it's not logical, not even slightly. You're actually better off, in my opinion, to go with the Greek and get rid of a lot of the Christian stuff from today and go back to the original Greek as much as you can, or go back to the Ebionites, or go back as far as you can. Or, as I said, go back to Africa and learn the true names of the divine in Africa from your own heritage. The New Testament quotes match the Septuagint, that's the Greek text, that is 2,250 years old. They are often word for word, New Testament to the Septuagint, which means you know that whoever was writing the New Testament were using the Septuagint for their writing. And we know that the earliest copies of the New Testament are not from the days of Jesus. We know that a lot of them are 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, and so on. But they're not 1,000 years later. They're only a few hundred or 100 years later. And because of that, we can see that the text they were quoting from was not anything to do with the Masoretic text. It was the Septuagint or Greek text of their day. So now moving into this Jesus or Isus from what it really is actually, because it's the name that the sacred name, they're replacing Jesus with these other names, or God, or the Holy Ghost, and all that kind of thing. They're using these other names to replace them. I.e., S-O-U-S, or Isus, appears, or Jesus, in the New Testament manuscripts dating to approximately 300 to 400 AD. That's already 600 years older than the Leningrad Codex or our modern Hebrew text. But more importantly, Isus is already being used as the Greek rendering of the Hebrew name. The Greek writing is using Isus. It's not using Jesus. We know that. The J only came around 400, 500 years ago. But the sound of the J came from an I and a vowel, two vowels together with an I. Because when you look at the oldest Bible of the King James, James doesn't have a J. It's I-A-M-E-S for James. So James or James. And they used the J when the J came about. But it's not like it was just drawn out of nowhere, right? So the Isus, and then later Latin and that kind of thing. It did change. Yes, there's no doubt they're not exactly the same, but they're very, very, very similar. But these names, we have documents 300-400 years after Christ with these actual names on them. That's 600 years earlier than any text of the Hebrew text that we have. As I mentioned, the Septuagint translators rendered both Joshua of the Old Testament and then later the people that wrote the New Testament used Jesus, the same Isus, as the same as Joshua that was used in the Septuagint. So this Isus is not some name made up out of Zeus, right? We'll get into that in a minute. So this is not an accident or a corruption. They took the name from an ancient name in this Aramaic Hebrew they had at the time, which we don't have any anymore at all. So we can't say it came from Yahusha or Yeshua or anything like that because we don't know. Those are all modern inventions. So Isus is in Greek. Jesus is in Latin. In classical Latin, the initial I was pronounced as a Y consonant. So Jesus sounded more like Jesus. As Latin evolved into European languages, that initial sound gradually shifted, and in German today, the J is still pronounced Ye or Y, a direct survival of the Latin pronunciation of Jesus. In English, the J sound hardened into what we use today in Jesus. And where I'm living, of course, it's Jesus. But that is traceable, and it's documented, linguistically documented evolution across connected languages over 2,000 plus years. There's no mystery, there's no conspiracy, just normal sound shifts that linguists can demonstrate and date across over 2,000 years. And compare that to Yeshua. No ancient manuscript attestation or documentation, coined in 1936, structurally incorrect in Hebrew, rejected by every Hebrew scholar outside the sacred name movement. So if we want to call Jesus Yeshua, and we feel that that's his name, there's no documented evidence at all, nothing that would say that that's his name. So if you don't like Jesus, then we have to come up with something else. But if we feel that people should be called by their name, okay, then we do the best we can. And of course, Jesus' name was not Jesus exactly in the Aramaic, but we don't have what it is either. But we do know it was the same as, very similar to Joshua, because Jesus was written 250 years before Jesus was born, which means Jesus was already in existence when Jesus came about. So when they chose the name Jesus, it wasn't like it was just out of nowhere. In the next section, I want to talk about this Jesus equals Zeus, because that's a claim we hear today. And that commenter said that fallen Jesus, Jesus, Zeus, Christos, he made the argument these are all the same name, and therefore worshiping God is worshiping a fallen pagan today. And that claim is everywhere. As I said, I've seen it everywhere, thousands of videos everywhere, all over the time, okay? And it sounds convincing, it really does. I looked at it, listened to it, and it was like, okay. So Zeus is spelled with the same sort of letters, and Jesus is derived from Zeus, so it's just another name for Zeus. But this argument falls apart on basic linguistic examination. The Zeus, S-O-U-S, ending in Isus, is not the Greek word for Zeus. In Greek, Zeus appears in different grammatical forms. Zeus in the nominative, Dios in the genitive, I guess they call it, Dios in the genitive, Dia in the accusative, and the form Zeus, Z-E-U-S, does not appear in Greek as a suffix, putting things together using Zeus. The Zeus ending in Isus comes from the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew name. But the form Zeus, in the name Isus, it comes from whatever the Hebrew Aramaic script was they translated from in that day. We don't even have that word that it even came from. So if we follow the logic of shared letters in one grammatical form, therefore the same word, we could prove almost anything. The name Susan contains San, and San sounds like Zan, and Zan sounds like Zane, and Zane is Zeus. Therefore, Susan is a pagan name. This is not linguistics, this is association. There's no place that Zeus, Z-E-U-S, is used with other letters put together into a word that means Zeus, okay? So Zeus was just Zeus, okay? Or used as Dios and Dia and those kind of things. But Isus is not from Zeus. No credentialed scholar of ancient Greek, no, not one, accepts that Jesus, Zeus etymology, not in any mainstream university, not in any peer-reviewed journal, not in any reference work on Greek etymology. The claim exists entirely among the sacred name movement and certain Hebrew Israelite communities, and has no scholarly support whatsoever. The Greek name Zeus comes from the Proto-Indo-European root Deus, meaning sky or heaven, the same root that gives us the Latin Deus, or in Spanish Dios, and the Sanskrit Dios Pita. It has no Semitic connection and no connection to the Afro-Asiatic languages, and no connection to the Hebrew that they had in the day, because we don't even have it to even know if it's a proper rendering. There are two names from two different language families that share two letter combinations in one particular grammar form. That's it. That's the entire basis of the claim. There's nothing else. The Septuagint completely eliminates this argument, and I think we realize that the Septuagint is the version of the Ethiopian Bible, which that Rome never got their hands on, which the Pharisees didn't get their hands on. So the Septuagint that comes through, the Ethiopian with its Jubilees and all the other books that were taken away, that Septuagint version makes it clear. It was translated by Jewish scholars, which is why they call it the Septuagint. 70 different scholars from different tribes, they translated it to make up the Greek version. And it was done 250 years before Jesus was born. People who had every reason to avoid any name that sounds like a pagan deity. You got to remember, they were translating it into Greek. They weren't going to choose Greek gods for their name of their god. These were observant Jewish translators working 200 years, as I said, before Christ, and they were not trying to sneak Zeus into the Hebrew language, into the Hebrew scriptures. They were rendering a Hebrew name into Greek using standard phonetic conventions of their language. So the book of Joshua in the Septuagint uses Jesus for Joshua throughout. No one argues that Joshua of the Old Testament was given a pagan name by the Septuagint translators. But the moment the same name appears in the New Testament, the exact same name, suddenly it becomes a Zeus conspiracy. That's not logical. It's the inconsistency collapses the argument completely. The next section I just quickly want to look at is Baal, because the Baal worshippers, which, is a pagan god, which the Israelites were worshiping all the time. So how does that enter in? Through the word Lord. So this comment from this commenter said that Lord equals Baal. And this is another extremely widespread claim in the sacred name in Hebrew Israelite communities. The argument is that when Christians use the word Lord, they are actually worshiping Baal, the Canaanite deity. I'm not going to say whether they are or they are not, but in terms of the languages we're talking about right now, what Baal actually means in the ancient Semitic language or the Hamitic languages, the word Baal or Baal means owner, master, or lord. It is a common noun. It is used as an ordinary word meaning lord or master in many contexts, completely unrelated to any deity. So a husband was referred to as Baal. A landowner was Baal of his land. The word is a title and a common noun, not exclusively a divine name. So when the Canaanites used Baal as a divine name, they were calling their deity the Lord or the Master. And the title became associated with the deity. But the title itself existed as a common word before and alongside the religious use. Now on to the English word for Lord. The English word Lord comes from the Old English lafward, meaning bread guardian or loaf ward, the person who guarded the bread supply, which was the basis of feudal authority. It has no Semitic or Afro-Asiatic origin whatsoever. It did not come from Baal. It did not come from any Canaanite religious tradition. It developed entirely within the Germanic language family in medieval England. The deeper problem, and really it was the Aramaic, it's not even just the Aramaic text of what we call modern Hebrew, it was the Aramaic itself. When leaving Babylon, they gave up their real Shemitic Hebrew, which was from Shem, and they took up an Afro-Asiatic language and called it Hebrew. So what we consider Hebrew is not from Shem at all. It's from Babylon, Assyria. It is an Afro-Asiatic language, and that is how linguists classify it. So what is the honest answer? Honest, for me, we don't actually know. We don't know what Jesus' actual name was in Aramaic. We don't. We know that Greek Jesus is the earliest name that Jesus is known by in the records. So we don't know his original name, and we don't even know the original name of the Father, or Abba, in the ancient Hebrew texts that came with Moses. We don't know that. That's the honest answer. We don't have it. And anyone who claims otherwise, in any direction, is claiming way more than the evidence supports. This is what we can say in confidence. Jesus is the oldest documented form we have in any surviving manuscript. It is not a corruption or a colonial invention. It is simply the earliest name we can actually verify. The Septuagint, which contains Isus, predates the Masoretic text by over 1,000 years and matches the New Testament, Old Testament quotations far more consistently than the Masoretic text does, and the timeline as well. The Masoretic text was compiled by rabbinical scholars who had every theological motivation to minimize messianic prophecies. It removes 1,400 years from the biblical timeline. It altered passages in the New Testament quotes directly in their Old Testament, and it contains deliberately falsified vowels, and it is written in a foreign alphabet, claiming to be Hebrew. Yeshua, Yahushua, Yahuah, Yahweh, all these things are 20th century American constructions with no ancient manuscript attestation or proof, built on structurally impossible Hebrew forms. Jesus does not derive from Zeus, and Lord does not mean Baal or Baal. These claims do not survive linguistic examination. So the honest position, if one follows the research, is this: we do not know what the Creator was called in the original tongue of the earliest biblical people. We do not know what the person called Jesus was called by his mother in daily speech in first century Galilee. The original names in the original language are not recoverable from where we stand today. Isus is the closest we have to documentation. Everything presented as older and more authentic is actually younger and less documented. That is not a defense of colonial Christianity, it is simply what the evidence shows. As I said, I spent months using these names, though I'm not in the Black Hebrew Israelite group, as you can imagine, but I felt completely for their plight and what understanding, so I wanted to understand, and I went along with it for a short time. But once I started to understand, that feeling of finding something left me, because I don't want to find another untruth. It's like when I leave Christianity and go seek for stuff before Paul, and I go back to the words of Jesus, and then back to the words of Elijah and Jeremiah. I want to find their words. I don't want to find something that someone else has placed on it. So whether one likes Paul or doesn't like Paul, that's fine. But I don't need to read Paul to understand what Jesus was saying. I'll read what Jesus said, or Jesus, what he said. That's what I'll read. I don't need Paul to help understand Jesus at all. In my opinion, I gave up reading Paul mostly just because he makes Jesus completely misunderstood, completely points away to a very different thing than Jesus taught. Jesus taught, if you love me, keep my commandments. Here is the Sermon on the Mount. Live every word of it. Be perfected. Follow me. That's what he taught. And what came from Christianity is something different. Does it mean it's bad? Nope. It's just I don't seek to follow those things. I seek to get back to the truth as much as I can. And I make errors like everyone else. Like I said, I used Yeshua, Yahuah, and those things. If you look at my earliest videos, you'll find that. But I don't anymore. I tend to use Jesus. And if people get upset, then that's fine. But that's the only thing I know that I can put in there that I'm comfortable with for right now. So as you're studying this out for yourself, follow all the evidence. Look at all of it. Try as much as possible, like Jesus said. Only the little children will get into the kingdom of heaven. Those that are willing to put aside the pride that we know best. I try to do that. It's very hard for adults. But we have to, in order to truly learn and accept, we have to be willing to unaccept everything we already think we know and look at it with a fresh eyes, like childlike eyes, to be able to see. There is something I wanted to add here that I hope will really help you, whether you're a Black American or Black African or African American living in the US, or you're in Brazil or Ecuador or India, wherever people were scattered to find back to your fathers. People now are using DNA and trying to track their fathers, and people are saying, oh, I'm Bantu, or I'm Igbo, or I'm Yoruba, or I'm from here, or I'm from there, or I'm from Ham, I'm from Kush, I'm from wherever. Great, find your fathers. But what's the most important thing that your fathers had? It was their language. More important even than their culture. It was their language. The language is what ties people back to the ancient days, is language. So if we want to find the ancient names, and we don't want to use the Greek because of colonial reasons and it's distasteful to us, that's fine. But at least we need to try to go back to what did your forefathers use for the name of the Creator? Because they didn't say Yahuah and Yah and Alua and all those things. They didn't say those things. That's not where it came from. That comes from the European tradition of your fathers, not the African tradition that was stamped out completely by both groups, the Pharisees and the Romans. If you want to find your own ancestors and your own language and your own creator and their names, find the tribes you come from and go speak to the people that are from those tribes and find out all the religious terminology you want to use. And I believe you will find, and I'm going to do some of that myself, because I believe that is where I'll find the real Hebrew among those tribes. But I would love to, and I'm just doing this research has made open new ideas even for me, even though those are not my ancestors. I would rather 100% look to the Bantu, Igbo, or Yoruba groups and see who their God's name and use that name and feel way more comfortable than using any name that comes out of the Masoretic text of today. I would, because they are closer to the source, passed down through their fathers. And they were excellent at doing it. I'm going to do a video on that in this same series. But they were excellent at that. They had people that were set apart just to memorize the past and the memory of the language and all those things. And that was their job in the community, or the jobs or a number of these people all the time, so they could track back the oral history for thousands of years. But this sacred name movement, please don't get deceived by it. It is full of holes and contradictions, and is less historical by 10 times, 100 times, than even the Greek texts that we have. We have to be willing to look at everything and see what's right and see what's wrong and throw it out. And when it says in scriptures, our fathers taught us lies, they did. Of course, mine did. We all did. It's not their fault. We were brought up in this world that Babylon controls, which is why my channel is called Fleeing Babylon. But in order to see Babylon, we have to be willing to look back through all the mists of the past and try to find out what is real, because it's all trying to be hidden. What is Babylon's main job to do? It is to push a different God or a different father, a different Abba, and hide him and present us with something else. Just like Babylon had that huge gold statue they had to worship, there's nothing different to the US or Britain or any other place in the world where they have up the big obelisks and all those things. They want us to worship the golden calf. Different forms, but it's still the golden calf. But if we want to find the words of our fathers, we have to go back to our fathers. My fathers, of course, don't come where your fathers are. If I was let's say I was Igbo person, I would be going back to the people that are Igbo speakers in West Africa, and I would going back to them and just querying them, how does this and how is that? And I'd probably want to even learn their language, knowing that I'm probably learning Hebrew. Certainly I'm learning Hebrew, or a form of it, rather than worrying about learning the Hebrew of our day, which to me is useless. But if Greek names feel too uncomfortable because of European Christianity, then we have to find what is comfortable for ourselves. That's fine. But please don't let other Europeans of another religion deceive us, or other pastors deceive us, or other secret society groups deceive us into believing something that is provably not true. So find your ancestors, find their language from whatever tribe or group you come from. But I want you to sit with this logic or this knowledge if you can. The sacred name movement of the Yahuah, Yahusha, all those names, they tell you that the European church corrupted the names, so go back to the original. And that impulse is probably correct. I got no problem with that. I'd love to know what the Greek original was before the Greek. But the problem is, where do you go back to? They send you to medieval documents that aren't even 1,000 years, or they're 1,000 years newer than the document you're trying to get to the bottom of. That doesn't work. Okay? It was compiled by people that hated the Messiah of that day. It's compiled, and they changed the texts out just to get rid of any chance that people could find something that would prove that Jesus or Jesus was who he said he was. And then they call what they come up with the original, because you know, they just want it to be original, I suppose. But it's not. It's not the original. They're just being as deceived or more deceived than the European churches deceived. It's all still Babylon, just another church of Babylon. They're moving from the sacred names that are the Greek names, which aren't, of course, correct, to these new Masoretic-based names that are completely not correct, rather than going back to your fathers in Africa or wherever and finding out what the true Hebrew, the true ancestors' names were before they were corrupted in the European, whether it's in the European religion of your choice. They all did the corruption and they all did the colonial power. We have to wake up. Your ancestors did not forget. They carried the names forever, and colonial powers suppressed them, the people, pushed them aside, taught them new ways, brought in the Bible, did all those things. They told African peoples that their traditions were primitive and their names of God were false. And that is the real theft. Not that the name Jesus were replaced with Yeshua, but that Chukwu or Olodumare or Mulungungu were told that they were not the real names of the Creator, when they were. And that is the sin. That is the great thing that is wrong. So if you want something that's old, that's real, that's not Greek, then go away from all of the colonial powers. Go back to your ancestors. Go back in Africa and find and love the languages which you were given of the name of the Father in your language. You don't have to compete with the Bantu if you're Igbo or if you're Yoruba. Your language, your sacred name movement should be within your own community, not following Europeans who have converted. Find your own heritage, find your own names. That would be my best thing I can do, because I don't defend colonial at all. I can't stand what colonialism and what Christianity has done to people all over the world, and that's a shame. But it's not an attack on people that are searching, even the ones that use the names Yeshua and Yahuah and all that. We don't need to criticize them. We just need to mention, hey, did you realize, did you know, did you? And even if that's another YouTuber, put a comment there and say, do you know that name, have you ever really looked into how old it really is? Maybe we should go back to, finding who they are. And if that presenter is from South Africa, or they're from Namibia, or they're from, I'm going to say, Nigeria, or from Ghana, ask them to look up and use the names of their own ancestors instead of using Yahuah, Yahusha, Yah, and all those things. So they may sound nice, but they are false. So go back to the beginning, but the back through your own families is, and I hope you enjoyed that. Here's a couple of videos I did, and I will add the second part to this when it's done and put a link to that here too as well. Have a good day, and thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Bye-bye.